We've already taken a look at constructor functions and how they can be used to help us to construct objects. Here's an example where I have a person constructor function up here, and using the new operator with this function, I'm able to create a new empty object, to set its initial properties, and then have it inherit from this object here, the prototype of the function. So if we, to recap, go over to the console and take a look at this person function, I can see that its prototype property points to an object that has some functions and properties on it. And if I take a look at me, the variable me, I'll see that its prototype property points up to that object. So what we're going to look at in this video is some native constructor functions that are created for us and come with the JavaScript runtime. So native just means that it comes with JavaScript. And let's take a look at the first one. This is going to be a constructor function that you're using a lot, whether you know it or not. It's called object with a capital O. So this is just a function, and it's called a native constructor function because it comes with JavaScript. And we can take a look at it. And we'll see that it has a prototype property. We have to scroll down a little bit, and here it is. And that prototype object, or the property that points to this object, will get inherited by any objects that are created with this constructor. So I could go ahead and create a new variable called myObject and assign it to a new object. And if we take a look at it, you'll see its prototype property pointing up to the object prototype. You see how they're the same? So it's equivalent to say that myObject is equal to a new empty object like this using object literal syntax. And that line is the same as writing this. Now, when I create a function, it turns out the function is constructed with a native constructor function also. So I can type var func, I'll just create a variable called func and set it equal to a function. And this function gets created with a function constructor. And so if I take a look at the function constructor, it too will have a prototype property. And if we look at the function that we just created and drill into it, you can see that its prototype will point up to the native function prototype. And so here's the prototype pointer, and we can see it's the same as the one up here. Let's look at it specifically by typing console.dir and function.prototype. Prototype. There we go. And we can drill into it this way. And so any of these methods here are available on my function object, like call or apply. And that's because they're on the function prototype. Now we can also create a new function by using the new operator. So let me say another func is equal to new function. And as a parameter in this case, we'll take the function body. But I'm just going to make this a blank function. And if we look at this function that we just created directly with a constructor function, you can see it looks very similar to the one that we created above using our normal function syntax. So far, we've looked at native constructor functions for object and function. There's a couple of more of the object type. So we can look at array and see that that's a function as well, and it has its own prototype property. And if you go on to MDN and take a look at any of the natives, you can get a sense for what their prototype methods are. But the next concept that I'd like to cover in this video is constructor functions that are used for primitive value types. I created a new variable here with an identifier of my number and set it equal to 5. So this is a primitive value. Something like a number, a string, or a boolean is our primitive values. And this one is a primitive value of 5. So over in the console, if I type my number, I'll get back its value, which is 5. But if I were to type a dot here, you'll see that Chrome is suggesting a couple of methods that are available. And the question is, where do these methods come from? Well, it turns out that number and a number of other, and the other primitive value types also have constructor functions. So if I type number with a capital N, you'll see that there's a native constructor function here. And if I take a look at its prototype property and drill into it, you'll see that that is where these methods are defined. Okay, so when I type my number and the period, that's where these methods are coming from the native number constructor functions prototype. But I want to explain a concept before we look at some of the other primitive constructors. When we call this dot on this primitive value, what's happening is JavaScript temporarily converts it into its object form. And so this number here, this number 5, gets converted into an object sort of like this. And then we're able to call functions and methods on this resulting object, like toFixed. This process of temporarily taking a primitive value and then converting it into its object form is called boxing the value. And one tricky thing is that once we're done calling this function, the value gets unboxed and it goes back to being in its primitive form. So to show you what's going on and to prove this concept to you, let's say that we add a property to my number called hello. So that will not fail. It allows me to assign the property, but if I were to look at it again, you can see that it's undefined. And that's because each time we call properties or access properties on this primitive, the primitive gets boxed into its object form, and then that object gets thrown away when the access is complete. Let's take a look at some of the other primitive constructor functions. Here's the Boolean native constructor, and once again we can use Constructor to take a look at its prototype. And I'd recommend this approach to exploration through the JavaScript language. You can just come on over to the console and play around with these objects directly. And we could play around here by creating a new Boolean and setting its primitive value to true. So we're sort of boxing this value ourselves right now. And the next one to look at is string. And similarly, you can see all the methods that you have available to you for string. So you can repeat this process with the other native constructors. The idea here is to show you an approach to interrogating and learning more about how these work. MDN is a great reference for this kind of stuff, and you can go through the website and check out all the different fundamental objects, like some that we just covered, object and function and Boolean, and even scroll down and see a bunch more that we didn't cover, like all the different types of arrays, keyed collections, and structured data. So now that I've shown you how to interrogate these prototypes and the constructor functions in the console, you should feel better about figuring out the rest of these yourself. So in this video, we extended our knowledge of constructor functions by looking at some of the constructor functions that come out of the box with the JavaScript runtime.